If you have ever stood in your backyard holding a dull handsaw, sweat running down your back, staring at a fallen branch that just will not budge, you already know the particular kind of exhaustion this story begins with. Maybe you have spent an entire Saturday trying to clear a storm-damaged tree from your fence line, your arms burning after the first 10 minutes, your hands blistered before lunch, wondering how anyone ever cut down something the size of a small building using nothing but muscle and a blade. Maybe you have watched a professional arrive with a machine that eats through a trunk in seconds and felt a strange mixture of relief and disbelief, thinking about all the hours you lost doing it the hard way. That frustration, that feeling of fighting against wood that refuses to cooperate, is exactly where this story starts, because the tool that eventually solved that problem did not come from a logging camp or a lumber mill at all. It came from somewhere almost nobody would guess, and the path from that first spark to the machine sitting in your garage today is one of the strangest chains of cause and effect in the history of technology. In the year 1830, in the German city of Würzburg, a physician and orthopedic surgeon named Bernhard Heine was struggling with a very different kind of cutting problem. Heine was in his 30s, respected in his field, and deeply frustrated by the surgical tools available to him. When patients suffered from severe bone disease or needed amputations, surgeons of the era relied on handsaws that were slow, imprecise, and brutally painful, since this was decades before reliable anesthesia. Heine was searching for a way to cut through bone more cleanly and more quickly to reduce the trauma of surgery and give his patients a better chance of survival. His goal was small and specific. He was not trying to change the world, he was trying to make one particular kind of operation slightly less horrific for the person lying on his table. To understand how strange his solution truly was, it helps to picture what surgery, and for that matter, what tree cutting, actually looked like before his invention. In hospitals of the early 19th century, amputations were performed with straight-bladed saws that required the surgeon to drag the metal back and forth across bone using brute force, often taking several agonizing minutes per limb, with assistants holding the patient down as they screamed. In forests, the situation was almost a mirror image. A single large oak or pine could take two grown men working with a long crosscut saw an entire day to bring down, sometimes longer if the wood was hard or the trunk was thick, and often multiple days when dealing with truly massive old growth trees that had been standing for centuries. Before that, axes were the primary tool, and felling a large tree with an axe alone could take a full day of continuous swinging, blister after blister, splinter after splinter, with the very real risk of the tree falling unpredictably and crushing the workers below. Logging camps in the 1800s were places of grinding, repetitive physical suffering, where men rose before dawn, walked miles into the woods, and spent 12 or more hours locked into a rhythm of pulling a saw blade back and forth through wood that seemed to resist every single motion. Villages near forests smelled permanently of sawdust and sweat, and the sound of axes ringing against trunks was as constant as birdsong. This was the world both Heine and eventually the timber industry were trapped inside. Heine's breakthrough came from an idea that seems almost obvious in hindsight but had never been properly executed before him. Instead of relying on a single blade moving back and forth, he designed a tool with small cutting teeth mounted on a continuous chain that could rotate in one direction around a guiding frame powered by a hand crank. He called it the osteotome, and it functioned essentially as a miniature version of what we now recognize instantly as a chainsaw, except its purpose was to cut through diseased or damaged bone in the human body rather than through wood. The device allowed for much finer, more controlled cuts than the old push and pull saws, reducing operating time and giving surgeons a level of precision that had simply not existed before. It was a genuinely elegant solution to an intensely narrow medical problem, and for years it remained almost entirely within the world of surgery, unknown to loggers, unknown to carpenters, unknown to anyone outside a small circle of European doctors experimenting with new surgical instruments. The first wave of consequences from Heine's invention stayed contained within medicine itself for a surprisingly long time. Surgeons across Europe began adapting the chain-cutting concept for other delicate procedures, including certain childbirth interventions where precise bone cutting was required to save a mother's life during complicated deliveries, a use that persisted in some clinical settings well into the 20th century. The idea of a chain-driven blade slowly circulated through medical journals and instrument catalogues, discussed among a specialized professional community that had no reason to think about forestry, construction, or agriculture. For decades, this remained a story about surgical innovation and nothing more, a quiet improvement inside operating theaters that most of the outside world never heard about. If the story had stopped there, Bernhard Heine would be a footnote in the history of orthopedic surgery, remembered only by specialists in the evolution of medical instruments. But ideas rarely stay contained forever, and the second wave of impact arrived when engineers, far removed from medicine, began independently exploring how a chain of cutting teeth might solve an entirely different kind of problem, one rooted not in the operating room, but in the forest. In the early 20th century, as industrialization accelerated and demand for lumber exploded to build cities, railroads, ships, and eventually entire suburban housing booms, the old methods of felling trees by axe and handsaw simply could not keep pace. Timber companies needed to clear larger areas faster, and the physical limits of human muscle were becoming an economic bottleneck. Around 1926 in Germany, an engineer named Andreas Stihl developed one of the earliest electric-powered chainsaws intended specifically for cutting wood, and shortly after, gasoline-powered versions began to appear from various German and American inventors, experimenting with similar chain-driven cutting mechanisms. These early machines were heavy, often requiring 2 people to operate, cumbersome by modern standards, and far from perfect, but they represented something the logging industry had never had before, a tool that could cut through a trunk in minutes instead of hours. The effects on the timber industry itself were immediate and dramatic. Logging crews that once needed a full day to bring down a single massive tree could now fell several trees in the same amount of time, and companies that adopted the new machines gained a crushing competitive advantage over those still relying on handsaws. Production numbers that once seemed like natural ceilings dictated by human endurance began climbing at rates that would have seemed impossible only a generation earlier. Regions of the Pacific Northwest in the United States, the forests of Scandinavia, and the timber-rich areas of Germany and Austria became testing grounds for this new technology, with lumber output in some areas multiplying several times over within just a couple of decades as mechanized cutting spread. Sawmills that had been limited by how much raw timber could physically reach them now faced the opposite problem, an overwhelming surplus of logs arriving faster than they could be processed, forcing entire operations to expand, modernize, and hire additional workers just to keep up. This is usually the point in these stories where I mention something practical, and honestly, if you find yourself getting pulled into these strange chains of cause and effect the way I do, where one small decision in one specific year quietly rearranges the entire world decades later, it might be worth sticking around because this channel exists for exactly that feeling. I am not trying to sell you anything, and there is no catch here. I just genuinely enjoy digging up these forgotten hinge points in history, the moments nobody at the time realized mattered, and I want to keep sharing them with people who feel the same pull of curiosity I do. If that sounds like your kind of rabbit hole, subscribing just means you will not miss the next one. And honestly, being part of a group of people who get excited about this stuff instead of finding it strange is a nice place to be. No pressure either way, but I would love to have you along for the next story. As the machines improved through the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, becoming lighter, more portable, and eventually usable by a single worker instead of 2, the third wave of impact began reshaping entire communities and social patterns far beyond the forest itself. Logging towns that had grown slowly for a century suddenly experienced rapid population surges as timber companies expanded operations to take advantage of the new efficiency, drawing workers from farming regions where mechanized cutting was displacing traditional agricultural labor as well. In the United States, towns across Oregon, Washington, and parts of the American South transformed almost overnight from small settlements into bustling company towns built entirely around sawmills and lumber yards, complete with company stores, worker housing, and schools funded by timber profits. Migration patterns shifted as young men left family farms in search of the higher wages that mechanized logging crews could offer, since a single chainsaw operator could now produce the output of what once required 4 or 5 men with handsaws, meaning fewer workers were needed per tree, but far more trees could be processed overall, creating a strange paradox where individual jobs became more specialized and better paid, even as the total number of trees harvested each year climbed into figures that would have seemed like fantasy in Bernhard Heine's era. Class structures within logging communities shifted too, as owning or operating a chainsaw became a marker of status and skill, dividing workers into those who had adapted to the new machines and those still clinging to older methods. A division that in some regions created real tension and resentment between generations of loggers. The economic ripple effects reached even further than the timber towns themselves. Construction industries that depended on a steady, predictable supply of lumber suddenly found themselves able to build faster and cheaper than ever before, feeding directly into the massive housing booms that reshaped cities across North America and Europe in the decades following the Second World War. Suburban expansion, which depended on affordable wood framing for millions of new homes, was quietly accelerated by the fact that lumber could now be harvested at a scale and speed that older methods simply could not have supported. Paper industries, furniture, manufacturing, shipbuilding, and countless other sectors that relied on wood as a raw material all benefited from the sudden surplus, and prices for many wood-based products dropped as supply expanded, making goods that had once been luxuries accessible to ordinary households. Entire national economies in heavily forested countries began to lean more heavily on timber exports as mechanized cutting made large-scale forestry operations profitable in ways they had never been before. And governments took notice, since a resource that could now be extracted faster meant tax revenue, trade opportunities, and geopolitical leverage that simply had not existed at the same scale in the 19th century. This economic transformation inevitably pulled politics and law into the story as well, marking the fourth and largest wave of consequences that Bernhard Heine could never have imagined sitting in his surgical practice in 1830. As mechanized logging accelerated the pace at which forests could be cleared, governments in heavily timbered nations were forced to confront questions about land ownership, resource management, and environmental protection that had simply never been urgent before, because no one had ever been capable of clearing forest fast enough for it to feel like an emergency. In the United States, growing concern over the speed of deforestation contributed to the strengthening of the national forest system and the expansion of regulatory bodies tasked with managing how much timber companies could legally harvest each year. Debates that grew more heated as chainsaw-powered logging made it possible to strip vast tracts of land bare within a single season rather than a single decade. Countries in Scandinavia developed some of the earliest sustainable forestry laws in response to the same pressures, recognizing that a tool powerful enough to fell a forest in years rather than generations required an entirely new legal framework to prevent total resource collapse. In parts of the developing world during the mid-20th century, access to mechanized logging equipment became tied to broader questions of economic development and foreign investment, with international companies exporting chainsaws and industrial forestry techniques into regions of South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia, often reshaping local economies, displacing indigenous communities who depended on those forests, and triggering political conflicts over land rights that in some cases continue to this day. A surgical tool invented to spare patients a few extra minutes of pain on an operating table in Germany had, within a century, become entangled in international trade policy, land rights disputes, and environmental legislation on multiple continents. By the second half of the 20th century, the chainsaw had evolved into the compact, gasoline-powered, chain-driven tool instantly recognizable today, refined by companies including Stihl, Husqvarna, and McCulloch into lightweight machines that a single person could carry into the woods and operate with minimal training. What had once required a full logging crew and an entire day of exhausting labor could now be accomplished by one person in a matter of minutes, and this efficiency spread the chainsaw far beyond professional forestry into the hands of ordinary homeowners, farmers, and hobbyists around the world, turning what was once an industrial tool into something as common in a suburban garage as a lawnmower. Global timber production numbers that had grown steadily since the introduction of mechanized cutting continued climbing through the latter half of the century, with worldwide wood harvest figures reaching levels that would have been unimaginable to loggers working with handsaws just 100 years earlier, feeding into everything from global paper consumption to the construction materials used in skyscrapers and homes across dozens of countries. Yet buried inside this story of efficiency and progress lies a genuinely ironic twist, the kind of contradiction that seems to follow almost every transformative invention throughout history. The very speed and power that made the chainsaw such a celebrated tool of human ingenuity also made it one of the primary instruments of large-scale deforestation across the planet, contributing directly to environmental crises that the world is still struggling to solve. Vast portions of tropical rainforest in regions such as the Amazon Basin, Southeast Asia, and Central Africa have been cleared at rates that were physically impossible before mechanized cutting existed, with satellite tracking studies showing millions of hectares of forest disappearing annually in some of the most heavily logged regions of the world. A pace directly enabled by the descendants of the very machine born from Bernhard Heine's careful, humane attempt to make bone surgery a little less painful. Climate scientists studying global carbon emissions have repeatedly pointed to deforestation as one of the significant contributors to rising atmospheric carbon levels, since forests that once absorbed carbon dioxide are instead being converted into cleared land. And the tool that made that conversion possible at an industrial scale traces its lineage directly back to a hand-cranked surgical instrument designed to save lives rather than to reshape the climate of an entire planet. The same invention that reduced human suffering in operating rooms powered the construction of affordable homes for millions of families, lifted entire regional economies out of poverty through timber exports, and turned back. Breaking 12-hour logging shifts into manageable single-person jobs also became, quietly and gradually, one of the tools most closely associated with the ecological damage now facing the modern world. A genuinely strange inheritance for something that began with such a narrow, compassionate purpose. And if you trace the thread all the way back, past the global forestry debates, past the suburban housing booms, past the company towns and the international trade routes, past even the earliest gasoline-powered logging machines of the 1920s, you eventually land right back where this story started, in a modest surgical practice in Würzburg, Germany, in the year 1830, where a physician named Bernhard Heine was simply trying to make one specific painful procedure slightly less traumatic for the people lying on his operating table. He was not thinking about forests. He was not thinking about deforestation or housing booms or international trade policy or climate change. He was thinking about a single patient in a single moment and a saw blade that moved back and forth in a way that caused more suffering than it needed to. That is the strange, almost unbelievable truth sitting underneath the tool now leaning against the wall of countless garages, sheds, and logging trucks around the world today. Something as loud, powerful, and permanently associated with cutting down forests as the chainsaw did not begin in a forest at all. It began with one man's quiet, careful attempt to ease a single kind of human pain, And in trying to solve that one small problem, he set in motion a chain of consequences, quite literally, that would eventually reach every continent on Earth.